What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Beyond the Bar podcast. I'm your host, Denisa Tova. And today we're mixing it up a little bit. We were stepping into the exciting intersection of sports, data, future of football. And it really is super fascinating. At least to me, it is. And today, here we've got Eric Eager. I think, he is a mastermind in sports analytics. He's been changing the game from the ground up. He has a very interesting background from his days as a professor to becoming a key player at Pro Football Focus. And now he is leading the charge at SumerSports. And his journey has just been super interesting. Eric, welcome to the show.
It's great to be on here. It's so much fun to talk about sports and to talk about life and its journeys.
Yeah, no kidding. We actually, I mean, today's what we're recording. It's the second day after Super Bowl. Very exciting, and we actually started this conversation. And I always say, I was not raised in the U.S., so I'm not as knowledgeable when it comes to the rules of football. It was more or less a soccer, but I'm fascinated. You have a human interest, and the game was just incredible. And so my question to you was, for someone like Mahomes, when you look at a guy like that, is it genetics? Is it leadership? I mean, how do you pull it off? What is it about him?
The answer is probably yes to all of that. I grew up in Minnesota. I know you interviewed Matthew on his on one of your last shows. His book is right behind my shoulder over here, which is cool. I the first ever Twins game I went to in Minneapolis. Patrick Mahomes' dad, Pat Mahomes, was the starting pitcher in that game. So clearly he's got some genetics, having his dad be a major league pitcher. But I think some of it is also just kind of mathematical, right? It's exponential in the way things work, where you if you're one of the major researchers in a field, then all the grad students want to work with you, and then you have brilliant grad students working for you. They teach you all these great things, and you get your name on papers, and you get your name on other papers, and so all of a sudden now you're a leading researcher in the field, and everything sort of grows exponentially. If you're a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes, who has Super Bowl experience, then that and you win, then the next time you're in the game, everybody's talking about how you have Super Bowl experience against the person against you, and so you immediately have that edge, and that edge sort of compounds over time. And it's why you see, everybody in statistics like to talk about like the normal distribution, which has what are called thin tails, meaning the probability of rare outcomes is relatively low, but in life, more often than not, you go to what are called power law distributions, what are called fat tails, which mean a lot of times you do get these like runaway outcomes. In the National Football League, it's Tom Brady winning 7 Super Bowls. In in life with wealth, right? It's wealth isn't normally distributed. You have a very few individuals with a lot of wealth. The Pareto principle being like 80% of the wealth is owned by 20% of the people, and you sort of get that sort of working in it. And all of that is basically what you're just describing, which is when you get resources, when you get success, that success gives you access to more success and more success. And Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City are just the next great example of that, where you get into the Super Bowl one year, and now all of a sudden every team that plays you is almost over trying or over, they're not as loose as they could be, because they're trying to slay the dragon that is you, which gives you an advantage over the time that you had when you were previously inexperienced. And so it's such a fun phenomenon, and it sort of permeates kind of all aspects of life.
What about psychology? Meaning dealing with the pressure of, not playing in your home turf, or dealing with the pressure of, the media, even just like for an ordinary person, right? To put yourself out there, that's not easy. Public speaking, being on social media. What about that? How does that factor in? Because when I watch him, it's almost like he looks like a cyborg. It's like he is so focused, and it almost like he tunes it out. It's like there's just a field, and that's it. There's a dirt, and I have a goal. And there are others, obviously, not just him. But how do you feel that plays into it, being able to sort of tune everything else out?
Yeah, and I think all of that comes with success, right? I think when you have success, you end up with the confidence of being able to fail without it being taken personally. Like I always think about, I do TV and radio, for example, and if I predict a game wrong, it's like, well, I predicted games right a million times before, and so it reflect on me personally that I get a game wrong. Whereas if this is the one shot you're ever going to have at something, you may or may not be tense. To your point about psychology, it's like with Mahomes, it's like if he never wins another game the rest of his life, he's a Hall of Famer. So with that
Mm.
in his back pocket, this is like the foundation of kind of like every religion too, where it's like you have salvation, so you can kind of treat people well, you can do well at your job without sort of feeling that pressure, et cetera, because you have the backdrop that is the strength of whatever your belief system is. And I think for people like Patrick Mahomes who have achieved so much, that's the psychological backing that they have, where you're like, I've already got so much bank to draw off of that I can try new things. I can explore new avenues. I can take chances and risks. And and the same thing with investments. You look at a poker table, for example, you look at the financial markets. Oftentimes it's not even the player with the best hand or the best cards or the best business or the best investment. It's more the person with the biggest bankroll that can lean on other people because they can
Yeah.
they can withstand up and downs more than somebody who doesn't. And I think Patrick Mahomes in football is sort of the embodiment of that. He's just got so much equity in the game that he loves to stand on, that he can take chances and uh, do everything from a position of strength. And so things that might affect other players, like playing a game in Vegas or playing a game at the end when there's so much pressure on him, I think all of those things impact different players differently, and in many cases worse than they do Mahomes, who's the best player in the whole sport.
Almost want to. I'm tempted to lead forward to discussion about data. How do you take someone who may not be, I'm going to be careful here, as well positioned as Mahomes, and get them close enough by using data? But before I ask that question, I want to explain your journey to being sort of a data analyst, data scientist. It's because you've gone from playing college football to getting a PhD in math. That's super impressive. And now you're a big name in sports analytics. How did you end up combining your love for football and math into this career? It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I grew up loving sports, and sports were always sort of my vehicle for trying to understand numbers. Like I would be playing the game. I was the annoying kid that was like counting the number of rebounds they had, counting the number of points they had. And I always sort of knew that. And I know coaches hate that. So, when I was growing up a little bit further in my life, I sort of stopped doing that and learned to be more of a team player and everything. But that was sort of how I related. I always related to players based upon how much they scored and how good they were in that realm. And then I played football. I wasn't the best player in college. I thought that I actually made probably a bigger contribution tutoring the left and right tackle on my team on bus rides to and from the games in math more than I probably did catching the ball or making any blocks myself on the football field. And you get to a certain point where you've had enough concussions or you had enough injuries where you're just like, it's time for me to move on. I was lucky enough because I love sports so much that math came a little bit later to me. I started really like reading books about math and learning about the Euclids and the Laplaces. Laplace is my favorite mathematician. The Bayes, those key players, Riemann, Bernoulli, all 8 or 9, 15 of them. By the time I was like a senior in college, like I was so turned on by this idea of being a mathematician that football was kind of a secondary thought to me. By the time I was done playing, I had already wanted to go to grad school, so I went and accepted an offer even before my eligibility was done, and so I went to the University of Nebraska, and I wasn't even expecting necessarily to be still into football. Like I was kind of like wanted to put that life behind me. At the time, Moneyball was starting to become a thing in baseball, and I love baseball, but again, it was sort of more of a very rudimentary love of the sport. And so I just like went and got a PhD in applied math. I studied mathematical biology. I wasn't really into the numbers of football. I kept being a fan. It really couldn't escape me. And then when I became a professor, I first 3 years I published as many papers as I could. I became tenured when I was 29 years old, and so I was kind of in this weird spot where I was young. I had accomplished a lot of like the modest goals I thought of that as far as publishing papers and getting grants and everything, that I ultimately started consulting for a bunch of different companies. And then eventually Pro Football Focus, which was owned at the time by Chris Collinsworth, who I admired quite a bit as the commentator on Sunday Night Football. I was convinced that a lot of the Moneyball stuff that was done in baseball should have been done in football.
Mm.
To much of my surprise, once I started digging into a lot of the possibilities there, it wasn't. And so I was very fortunate that I was able to uh, get my hands dirty on probably the richest data set that at the time existed in football, and pin down some of the key solutions to a lot of the problems. Eventually, I left academia to work for PFF full time. I ran research and development there for a number of years, and then in 2022, I joined Thomas Dimitroff, who's the former general manager of the Falcons, and we helped start SumerSports with Paul Tudor Jones and his son Jack started the company, and now we're in charge of a great deal of that company right now.
Wow, that was a fast track. That is fascinating. So there's a lot of talk about data. And how does, in simple terms, as if you were explaining it to your daughter turned 11, right? Was it last week?
Yeah, yep. During
You have a
Super Bowl week
9-year-old
is
and
always every year. Yep.
yeah. So if you were explaining it to her, how would you explain data analytics and how, where I'm going with this, how do you see it changing or maybe already has changed how football teams make decisions? But then, sort of the big picture is because the data seems to be the big buzzwords and it seems to be creating opportunities, for young students who you may be studying, statistics and the only sort of, or not the only, but um, like the obvious field to go into was to become a pension actuary. I mean, who the heck wants to do that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a professor, when I was a student, that was if you wanted to get a degree in math, you had to be an actuary, a math
Yeah.
teacher, or go and get your PhD. And at the time, I didn't really want to teach. Came to like teaching a decent amount, but I never wanted to teach like 6 hours a day like a high school teacher. God bless them. Actuary was one. I did do a decent amount of actuarial studies when I was in college, and then you could go and get a PhD. But even like when you're a PhD, like all the people that are teaching you, they got their degree and are teaching at a university. So they're like they're looking at replacing themselves, but like the economics of it are they should only have to replace themselves once in the course of their career
Mm,
because there aren't that the population growth in the US is not that big and the university growth is even smaller. And so they're kind of not equipping us all that well. My PhD advisors, one's an ecology professor, one's a math professor. They don't really have any industry experience. And so
mm,
you're not that equipped when you get to become a professor to tell students like what's possible for them. And, once I got in, I had consulting gigs with, the United States Geological Survey, the EPA, things like that. One of the things that precipitated me leaving academia to go and work in football full time was I had a grant proposal to build models to help prevent birds getting killed by windmills, and the Trump administration turned it down. And so I was just like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get federal funding to do some of this research. And so I went into football, which seemed more friendly. But, as you sort of grow, like data science has really uncovered a lot of this, a lot of the applications. And if I was going to talk to tell my daughter, like, kind of where this applies, it's, we have decisions we make in life all the time. And whether those decisions are, who our friends are or what house we buy or who we marry, a lot of times those decisions, you make those decisions with your gut. You trust your gut. And I think a lot of times, a lot of those decisions, and some of them in sports, they are reserved for your gut. Some of those decisions you need to make, with your heart and things like that, because you don't really want to say, "Oh, I married somebody based upon an algorithm." That to me seems like a heartless thing to do. But there are some decisions like which college you should go to, or
Yeah.
which house you should buy, or should you go for this fourth down, or should you prefer a linebacker over a cornerback in the draft? Those things, data might not be able to dictate how you make those decisions, but data can help you better understand the consequences of making either side of the decision. And I think that that right now is a good way. And then also being data driven can help you understand what is being done to you, right? When you open TikTok,
Mm.
why are you being shown this video and not that video? When Twitter is now showing you this recommendation and not that recommendation, why are they sending certain women pregnancy products in the mail and other women not pregnancy products in the mail? Like, why is that happening? And all this kind of stuff is important to know, because there are some companies that would want you to make all of your decisions based upon algorithms. And so in order to combat that, you have to have a fair fight, and having a fair fight amounts to knowing what goes into some of these things. And so that's incredibly important.
I like what you're saying because you're not saying the data will replace the gut instinct, so to speak. You almost need both the quantitative, the qualitative. Going back to our conversation about Mahomes, how can you use the data to cultivate, hmm, to cultivate, to attract, or maybe to identify, someone like him? Because we talked about how it's a combination of so many different factors, not just one or two. But how could data potentially identify someone like that?
Well, I don't know if the data can come in and say, on average, this, like, I was a huge proponent of drafting Patrick Mahomes. Now I'm a Kansas City fan, and when they drafted him, I was ecstatic. It's easy to say after the fact. I think that there's also articles I wrote like where I was like, here's what we missed about him. I
Mm,
think that going back and looking at him and trying to be descriptive about why we missed on him could also be faulty too, because sometimes his situation just helps him so much as well. And the other part is there are just distributions in life. So Patrick Mahomes is mean if his average, if he goes to the average of 32 teams, maybe he's not quite as good, but maybe he went to the best situation, and so we're getting the 95th percentile of him. Statistics can
mm,
allow us to sort of understand and have a language upon which to frame what we're seeing with Patrick Mahomes. It wasn't that the average outcome was that much better than the other players in his draft, Mitch Trubisky and Deshaun Watson and Deshaun Kaiser. It was more that maybe the tail outcome, as I talked about earlier, the 95th percentile, the 99th percentile for him was so much higher. And maybe what Kansas City saw was we have an infrastructure with great supporting cast, with a great head coach, with a great front office. If we hit on all of those things, the
mm,
95th percentile for him is so much better than all the other players I stated, even if the averages are about the same, or maybe in his case, maybe even projected average is worse than the other guys that are with him. The ceiling is higher. And in football, you're almost always drafting for the ceiling of a player's distribution. Because again, no one really cares. Like we're at Super Bowl Wednesday, right? We're at Super
yeah.
Bowl Tuesday today. No one really cares no one remembers who the Chiefs beat to go to the Super Bowl, the Ravens. No one's going to remember that in a month. We
Yep.
remember who won the game. And
Yep.
in some ways, like, you're optimizing for your tail outcomes, not the median outcomes. And math
Mm.
can help you do that. And humans are incredibly bad at that. And that could be a use case. And a lot of other cases is Patrick Mahomes can be, as I said earlier, the it can be the humbling experience, which is to say, math couldn't help us find Mahomes. Let's go
Mm.
back and see what we missed and where we messed up. And there's a number of quarterbacks, Josh Allen being one of them. I think Jordan Love is about to be one of them, where traditional ways of looking at the position have left us wanting more from an analysis standpoint. And then the question becomes, is it just variance? Is it just noise? Is there irreducible complexity to what we're trying to understand here? Or are there clues that we've missed for decades
Yeah.
that we can lean in on? One of them, for example, with Patrick Mahomes, is the fact that he avoids sacks at a rate that, and he did in college at a rate that is just incredible. And that thing has been one of the stickiest statistics throughout college to pro for almost every quarterback, good and bad, forever. And that was something that was not part of the discussion when he was drafted out of Texas Tech in 2017.
Interesting. It really is just another angle, and it's a really helpful tool. Again, not the single most important tool, but very important tool. You also teach at Wharton's Moneyball Training Academy. What's the biggest thing that you want the students to learn? And also, I'm always curious. Well, what are they curious about?
The curiosity is the biggest thing I want them to learn. I think that the biggest thing is you don't go into this endeavor with a goal in mind. I take so in a position like mine, you get a lot of people who email you and like, hey, I want a job in sports. And I've been in this position before where I've had relationships where, I there was always like oh, there could be something that comes to this. And so we all fall prey to this.
Yeah.
And I think that as you get older, you prize this. And I always, when I was a professor, that was always so annoying when students you get done with a proof or you get done with a solution and you're like, are there any questions? And a student would be like, hey, when are we going to get our test back? Or what's the curve on this test? And you're like, I just want you to learn the material. I just want you to appreciate the material. I just want you to really understand what's going on here. And what I love about the Wharton Moneyball group is, for the most part, they're so young at that point that they don't, like, the vocational aspect of it is not, hasn't dawned on them yet, where they really do want to understand sports for their own sake. And when you get older, like me, like, it can be less that way. We have families to support. We have, I eventually want to be on a team someday where I can win a championship. And so there's vocational aspects, goals there. I think that I've been able to maintain some of the uh academics, the wrong word, but like intellectual uh curiosity. But for me, the best part of the Wharton school is like when they're younger, that intellectual curiosity is the majority of their motivation for it. I want to know more about tennis. The students who like tennis. I want to learn more about esports. The students want to learn
Mm.
more about esports. And as an instructor, like, you get these questions and you think about, okay, what about League of Legends is going to tie back to football, and what can I learn from it? One of the teams that I admire the most in the NFL, the Baltimore Ravens. One of the reasons why is, one of their manager of analytics is actually now the director of player personnel for the Chargers as of 2 weeks ago. Corey Krawick,
Mm.
he won a Stanley Cup as a member of the Chicago Blackhawks, so he came from hockey. Another one of their analytics people, Derek Yam, he worked at StatsBomb, which is a predominantly soccer company. He went to go work for them as well. Being able to
Mm.
take ideas from other sports and have that curiosity as well, to me is a very cherished to me is a very cherished trait in people, being able to sort of have the curiosity to bounce back and forth. I'm not as like good at understanding soccer or baseball or things like that. It's a much more of a chore for me to do it, but I love the fact that, like, the Wharton School and being able to teach those students who have those curiosities kind of forces me into that realm.
Yeah, you're describing an entirely different world. Who would have thought that? It is opening up a set of gateways, and it's like there's this integration. Um, and the curiosity that's I've always been big on critical thinking, asking lots of questions, and that's really what fueled me to start this podcast. There's no pattern in my maybe it's the guest pattern that started sort of in the legal field, but if I meet someone who's very interesting and willing to share their story, I'm all over that. I think that's how we learn. Um, you wrote let's talk about your book. You wrote a book, Football Analytics with Python and R. What were you hoping to accomplish with this book? And what is the message in it?
If I say that, like, maintaining a friendship was, like, actually the key motivation, like, I would that's the truth. One of my best friends, Richard Erickson, and I, we were academics together. He actually worked at the United States Geological Survey while I was a professor. We have papers on how to model uh, of the avoidance of birds and bats running into windmills. Like we were like mathematical biologists together. And so then
That's so
when
cool.
I took the football job, I left town and we stayed friends, of course. And he messaged me, he said, "Hey, Eric, like I really miss working with you. Do you want to write a football book together?" I'm like, "Richard, you don't know anything about football." And he said, "Yeah, but you like I know how to format a book. I know how to code better than you." And which he's absolutely right. He does. And he said, "Let's do this." And I said, "Okay, well, I don't really have the time for this." I was back at Pro Football Focus. I was still running R&D there. And so I was like, "Okay, but I do agree. Like, we need to spend more time together." So I was like, "I'll write a proposal to O'Reilly. And if they turn me down, you'll never speak of this again. And if they accept it, I'll do it." And so I wrote a half a page proposal to the book company, and they accepted it in 6 hours. Because of course, like in hindsight, everybody wants a football analytics book, and
Yeah.
no one had written one yet. And
Wow.
so they wanted it, and we it took a few different rewritings. We started writing it in the summer of 2022. We finished it or we started writing it in the mostly in the winter of 2022, and then we got it done in the summer of 2023. So it took a while, but it was a lot of fun. And now, like I always say this in hindsight, now the reason that this book is so great is I get so many messages from people who want to be interns or want advice on how to get in the sport. Or I think even better is I'm very prolific in media where like I do podcasts and stuff, not like this kind of podcast, which is a lot of fun and different than what I'm used to, but I do sports podcasts where people want to learn about how to do analytics in sports or how to even think the way that I do. And now instead of like a hodgepodge of different ways in which I can like point somebody in a direction of what I do, I can just say, "Hey, like I have a book, and if you want to buy it, like I'd love to sign it for you or something." But or I can, you just purchase the book. Like now I have like a link I could just send people who message me on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever and ask, like, "How do I do what you do?" I could be like, "Hey, here's an intro book." But it's crazy how most things don't you start something with the intention that's way different than and what ends up being the reason the ultimate reason why something has value. And so the reason I started the book was to maintain my friendship with Richard, my co-author, and the actual reason is so that I can continue to serve the community now that I'm getting older and I don't have the infinite energy that I once had.
Birds and bats. Why? Why did you care about that topic?
Well, the math was fun to me. Like I'm a weird applied mathematician in that like the first
I love it.
decade of my the first decade of my career, I did the applied math because I liked the structures that I was working with. Now I wasn't perfect. Like the first ever theorem I proved was about a plant seed bank system where, and if anybody doesn't know, like a lot of plants, because of what's called environmental stochasticity, which is like weather and stuff like that, they store what's called a seed bank. So they create seeds, and not all the seeds actually germinate and become the new plant. A lot of them stay in the seed bank, which I think would resonate with a lot of humans because we put money in the bank and we don't spend it all the time when we make money. And plants do it too, and they do it more often. And this is evolution, and they deal with evolutionary pressures this way. We save money for a rainy day. That's the expression. They do it as well. And so the more random the environment is, the more that the seed bank matters to the plant. And so
Mm.
I built this entire like system and proved a bunch of theorems about this dynamical system. And I was so proud of myself. Whenever a mathematician proves a theorem, they think they're awesome, and I was no different. And I went ahead and went to this woman's office, Diana Pilson, was a 10-year full professor in biology, and I said, "Hey, I have this theorem about your system," and she goes, "Well, Eric, isn't actually how it works. And this was like my first introduction to actually how to be an applied mathematician. And she's like, well, Eric, like this is actually how randomness is introduced into the system, and it's multiplicative and not additive and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, like I got to learn all this new math now. And it's so funny because I think that that's how a lot of applied mathematicians fail in industry and fail in our line of work in football, for example. It's like you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. In reality, like you have to make the tool for the particular nail that you're working with. And so the second half of my PhD program was all amounting to learning this new set of math so that I could solve Diana's problems. And then I did, and that was how it ended up working. And then I realized that it applied to all kinds of things like birds and bats, because again, with birds and bats, you have to, it's about like their flight patterns are about disturbances to the system. And so you can sort of mitigate their risks by putting windmills in different places and knowing sort of their flight patterns and how they respond to environments and things like that, and their different survival probabilities and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, like I still liked and gravitated towards those kind of problems because those were the mathematical systems I was very well versed in.
Yeah.
And then I got into football, and those were mathematical systems I wasn't well versed in. And so I had to learn all this new math again. And this is again this sort of like the life cycle of a mathematician, whereas you get really comfortable working on one kind of problem, and then the data or the problem you're working changes, and you have to get better at it. And it's why the job is a satisfying one.
That is so fascinating. It really is. So now you are the head of the research and development at SumerSports. What's the vision for the company? And then for, interns who are interested in the data science, what type of opportunities are there?
Yeah, I mean, Paul and his son Jack, like Paul Tudor Jones is one of the most successful macro traders in the world. His son Jack was a data science major at Stanford, and has a lot of chops there. Is a lifelong Giants fan, and can tell you all the players that played for New York for all those years. And as a really fun kid to talk to. And they, I think, Paul has this portfolio analysis bend where he's, his entire career is buying and selling and making sure that he has all of his risks properly assessed for. And football rosters are not necessarily the same as that, but you can squint and make them similar. And so a
Mm,
lot of, what drew me there at Pro Football Focus, we had player evaluation tools. We had models that sort of told you how good the player was and how good the player would be and all this kind of stuff. But that was kind of the what. And eventually we transitioned into the so what, which is again, this is, and then predicting, so there will be. And then there's this sort of next step, which is to say, and then you should do this. And that's kind of what was a very I don't know, attractive part for me. Now, it's still a really hard problem because all of these teams are incredibly unique in how they grade players and their time
mm,
horizons and how uh and schemes. You look at, for example, the Super Bowl that we just saw, Kansas City, the first team in NFL history to win a Super Bowl with the quarterback making the most money in the league. The
mm.
last 2 years, they were the first team in the NFL history to win a Super Bowl with a quarterback making more than 14% of the salary cap. And so they have a really expensive, amazing quarterback, and their front office has to build a roster around him that is
Mm.
resilient and inexpensive. The 49ers have a quarterback that's making less than $1 million. And so they
Yeah.
can build around him more. They can build around him with players who make more money because he doesn't take up so much of the salary cap himself. And so our recommendation for a team like San Francisco would be different than a team like Kansas City, once everything is built out. A team like Carolina might be a little bit further, might be a little bit behind in terms of like where they're trying to be as far as winning a Super Bowl, whereas a team like Buffalo has wanted to win a Super Bowl for the last 5 years and can't get over the hump. Our recommendations for Buffalo are going to be different than Carolina. There are teams who want to win a Super Bowl but may not be ready, and is it our place to say, where is our place in the recommendation cycle to say you're not ready? Or do we just say, hey, given this is what you want, this is what you should do? Like there are all kinds of different, really challenging problems that make our job at Sumer hard. And I think one that I think anybody that starts a football analytics company maybe underestimates. And I think that that has been the case for almost anybody that's tried to work in this business.
But you love the challenge.
I do. I mean, I think that I always talk about what I do as a practice. Like
Yeah.
2000, 2020, I came out with wins above replacement. I was the first person to ever come up with a public wins above replacement model for football for every position. Ron Yurko, who's a brilliant professor at Carnegie Mellon, did it for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. And he did a very good job as well. But like the earlier versions of that had real issues. And so you learn from that. You learn from feedback from the league or feedback from the marketplace. I've had different analyses that talk about, different things about coverage versus pass rush that I think at the time, given the data that we had at the time, was probably the best I could have done. But now that I know more and I have access to different people and their brilliant opinions, I maybe am not as strong on what I thought. And so all of these things, all those hard worn um nuances and evolving, not only I evolve, but I think the game itself evolves. The NFL average NFL game was like a touchdown lower in total points to this year than it was during the pandemic year of 2020. So like
Yeah.
as the game evolves, are you willing to evolve with it? But also, are you willing to take feedback that you were wrong in the past and change it as well? And that particular thing about like being right or wrong about the constituent pieces of what you're working on,
Mm.
as well as being able to put them together in a way that the teams want and being sensitive to their needs, like all of those are challenges in the space.
Talking about humility, right? And empathy. I know we had a brief conversation. We talked about pet peeves, being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. I know that resonates with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's like the number one place where people fail, right?
Yeah.
And even framing it like that seems cheap, right? Like where you don't want
Yeah.
to. Empathy is not a tool to keep you from failing in life, right? I don't think you want to think about empathy as like a tool to achieve better, but like
Yeah.
empathy is the place where you can, the lack of it just sort of, it sticks out like a sore thumb in almost
Yeah.
every part of life. If you don't know where somebody's coming from on a bad day, on a good day, where somebody's coming from, if you're trying to sell them something, if they're trying to sell something to you, if you're where how they're approaching you politically, uh, that kind of thing. Like there's just so much where you, as you grow up and you think about kind of wherever you've made a mistake in the past, it's almost always been from a position of not really understanding the world around you, and almost every single time it's been about not looking at things through another person's eyes. And that doesn't mean that they're right, and that doesn't mean that you have to relent on your beliefs or your values, but it does help you navigate the system that you're in. And I would say for the majority of the mistakes that I've made in my life, that has, good or bad, whether I was right or wrong, and oftentimes it doesn't even matter whether
Yeah.
you're right or wrong. A lack of empathy has almost always been the core of it. And as you sort of move in and look at sort of trying to be a business that serves people, as you try to be in a situation like in football analytics, you're thinking about, there was this whole movement about like running backs don't matter, which the like think about that from a perspective of like, okay, most running backs in the NFL are African American, for example. Okay, telling an
Mm.
entire group of people who are predominantly from a historically discriminated against group that they don't matter. Okay, how does that sound to people? And
Right.
and of course, people like me would say when that was a flippant first order statement, that's not how we meant it. But that doesn't matter, right? It's how it's taken that
Yeah.
matters. And so a lot of us, like me, I just like stops talking that way. Um, when you look at it and try to, and it's made me a much better communicator about certain things. Like, I don't necessarily know if I was running a football team, if I would use a first round pick on a running back. But I also don't think if the running backs coach came up to me and said, "Hey, I really think that this running back's worth a first round pick," would I be as dismissive as I was when I was
Mm.
younger? Like, so you don't necessarily have to change how you interpret or how you apply your research or your work or your toil. But I think that if you understand where people come from, you can be a more effective communicator.
Communication is a key. You're right. You don't have to agree, accepting that we have a different set of preferences from our childhood that we carry. And that's, I think it's a starting point is, I'll listen to you, you listen to me. And yes, we would, I think, eliminate a lot of conflict. How do you're out there in public. How do you deal with what would you call them? People who troll the social media and just for the sake of leaving a negative comment, they do it. I mean, I personally just deploy a lot of compassion because it makes you wonder, what their upbringing was like, if there's a need to do that. And to me, it's different than a constructive criticism. How is that for you internally?
Oh, it was a lot harder a lot of years ago. Like, I think to the point of what we just talked about at the very beginning of this podcast, like when you're younger and you're trying to start out, it hurts. Like the
Yeah.
first teaching eval that called me a bleeping idiot, or the first podcast comment that said I was clueless. They're probably right, by the way. And that's the other part where you have to have the humility to realize that people who are trolling you are probably doing so for a reason. And then there's also, I think that a lot of high achievers, there are two different kind of high achievers. There are kind of the sociopathic ones, maybe, that like they never let it get to them. Maybe I think it's sociopathic because I can't be that way. And then there's people who are far more introspective, that take it all in. I, I'm the second part, where I'm like, I take it all in,
Mm,
but as I've got, and you take it and you learn from it, and you realize that this can't possibly be personal because they don't know me. They don't know that what I had for breakfast. They don't know who my kids are. They don't know who my wife is. They don't know where
mm,
I came from. They don't know what kids used to make fun of me for when I was in high school and why I have these insecurities. And so they don't know, and they don't know what I'd rather be do. Like, they don't know that this is my dream job, or this isn't my dream job, or whatever. They don't know any of these things about you, so they can't possibly be personal. And so they I would never take their criticism the same way I'd take criticism from my boss, Thomas Dimitrov, who's one of my best friends, who knows almost everything about me now, and can actually tell me, like, "Hey, I think that you're an idiot for saying this." And he would never say it that way, but he was saying, like, "Given everything I know about you, which is everything at this point, you really screwed up by acting this way." That's really
mm.
going to actually resonate with me more than somebody who, nameless, faceless person who doesn't know me. Um, Now I've been fiery in the past. When I started interviewing for front office jobs in the NFL, like I deleted a lot of social media and stuff, like, and that's because I've said some things back to people. Now I sort of enjoy the sparring because I very much don't take it personally myself, and so when I go back at somebody, I certainly don't mean it to them personally. But I've also stopped that because, again, because of the empathy bit. Like, you don't know, somebody's probably coming at you to hurt you because they're hurt. And
Right.
th- so, you realize that that's probably not a great way to spend your time. I'm not perfect. I still do it, but I do it a lot less. But as I've gotten older, to the point about Patrick Mahomes, it's like once you gain success in your career, you realize that, like, a lot of this is jealousy, a lot of this is envy, a lot of this is
Yeah.
just trying to knock you down a peg and get you off your get you out of your zone. A lot of this is trying to get you in trouble, so that you can lose a position that other people want and want to take from you. And so you just don't deal with it. But there are people, and it's funny, one of my I don't even know if I would consider him a good friend yet, but one a person that I've hung out with now who's incredibly successful, was a person that used to troll me on Twitter. And eventually I just played back at him a little bit, and we struck up a friendship, and now, like, we
Wow.
talk to each other all the time, and he's incredibly fun. And if I I just took myself a little less seriously once, and it was worth it. And I think that that's I don't think that that's common, nor do I think anybody should actually do that. But it's an anecdote of how you can if you're not so sensitive to these things, you can obviously make the best of them.
Thanks for sharing that. That's interesting. I actually the way I flipped it around and I'm not a robot, but when I do see it, it teaches me something about me. And I realize that whenever something that I read or see hits my stuff, there's a reason for it. Whereas somebody who's, sitting next to me reading the same thing may not have such a reaction. So I always go into myself and ask myself, why is it hitting my stuff? What is it about it that's really pissing me off? And, so just like you, being able to yeah, I can go at it with somebody just for the sake of, arguing, but that's a mute, um, that's not the point, but it's coming at it from, "Why is it hitting my stuff? What am I learning about myself?" And then deploying compassion and then just and if it gets extreme, which thankfully not yet, just you know, block their ass and just move on, So but yeah, this is really fun. Look, finally, your daughters, I mean, they're getting into sports too, right? How do you share your love for football with them? But at the same time, like, how do you encourage them, to find their own way, their own path?
Well, the one thing my parents and I, like, we are so different in a lot of ways. I think politically different. My dad never played sports really after a certain age. My mother certainly didn't. But what I appreciate so much about them was they came to every game.
Mm,
They came to the Super Bowl. And what's funny is I grew up in
wow.
Minnesota. Like, I didn't. My dad's a Vikings fan. I didn't grow up a Vikings fan. Well, I grew up rooting for the same team as my dad. But then when I got older, I'm like, I don't need to root for this team anymore. All they've done is break my heart as a kid. And so I, went to Nebraska Lincoln and I didn't make any money. The only team that was on TV when I was there was the Chiefs. And that's how I became a Chiefs fan.
Wait,
And so
wait,
that's
wait,
like,
wait, wait. I have a question right here about what you said. Yeah, how do you make that switch when so many years, right? You're rooting
yeah.
for one team. How does that happen?
Well, I'll say this, and I know your husband's a Vikings fan, I think. So I'll
Yeah,
say
yeah,
this
he's
very,
frustrated as hell.
empathetically. They made it easy. They
Mm,
made it
yeah,
pretty easy.
that's
Like,
true.
they
Yeah.
they lost the NFC Championship game on my birthday like 3 times as a kid. They growing up, it was just like heartbreak after heartbreak. And so at some point you're like, and so then they weren't on TV when I was living in Lincoln. And so I wasn't making enough money as a grad student to like go, to get cable or anything. So I just watched the Chiefs and I was like, I kind of like the colors better than I like purple. I kind of like, and I'm like, wait, I'm an adult. I can pick my favorite team. And they were also like rumored to move to LA. And so I was just like, go to
Mm,
LA then. I don't, and I'm never going to live in Minnesota again, all this kind of stuff. And so I picked
yeah.
my own favorite team. And so to my parents' credit, my parents came over that they live in Atlanta for the winter just to see their grandkids. And they came over and watched me watch my favorite team, my Chiefs, the team I didn't grow up rooting for, but the team I root for now. And they came and watched me watch the Chiefs. And so like they're so, even though again, we don't agree on a ton, but like the way in which they've been able to at least support, certain aspects of my life, despite the fact they may not understand or even agree with it, is inspirational for me. And so I look at my kids and like my daughters play lacrosse. I don't know anything about lacrosse. And frankly, the coach after the game, they play on Sundays, takes a little too long for my taste. Like I need to go watch the games for my job. But like I love watching, my kids play sports. My one
Yeah.
daughter's in basketball, one's in volleyball. Obviously, as a guy growing up in Minnesota, you didn't play volleyball growing up. I think they do now, which is awesome. But like I just love the fact that like I can enjoy what they do. My one daughter's an artist. She has a YouTube channel called Hershey Dragon, which is really cool. She makes these dragons and stuff. And so like
Oh,
I just like being able to support what they do and their passions and stuff like that. And to me, that's how I can connect with them. Now, luckily for me, my oldest is a Chiefs, like she loves watching the Chiefs with me. So like we just watch them together. My youngest is of course is the contrarian. She's up there rooting against everything that I love. But it's fun to watch them grow up, and it's fun to be able to, for them to grow up and appreciate who their dad is, but also grow up with their own set of tastes and be able to impart those tastes on me, as somebody who, is able to enjoy them for who they are and not necessarily try to make them into smaller versions of who I am.
Well, I don't know what it's gonna take to turn the Vikings around, but yeah, that's honest. I appreciate that. It's but I guess that's a whole another discussion. Hey, Eric, thanks again for joining us today and sharing your really interesting, fun, and an incredible journey.
Denise, this was awesome. I enjoy just getting to chat about life. It's so much fun, and it's such a gift. So thank you.
And to our listeners, Eric's book, Football Analytics with Python and R, is a must read for anyone interested in data behind the game. And of course, you can get the book and check out more about Eric at the links below. And don't forget to hit subscribe button on our YouTube channel, Beyond the Bar Podcast, and follow us on social media. Until next time, stay curious and inspired.